This case takes place in the United States of America in the year 1984. Meet Angela Marie Samota. Angela went by the name of Angie to her closest family and friends. Angie was born on the 19th of September 1964 in California, but she and her family moved to Texas when she was young. She was the daughter of Frank and Betty Samota, and she was the youngest of 5 children. Tragically, her father Frank died when she was only 1, and the details of her childhood are scarce. But it is known that she blossomed into a smart, curious, and creatively vibrant individual. Not to mention, her friends and family always testified to how beautiful she was on the inside and out. Angie was intelligent. She had her eyes set on an ambitious career in computer science and electrical engineering, and she enrolled in university to do just that. A friend of Angie once said that she was a triple threat. She was good-looking, smart, and had a great personality. These traits made her the object of envy. A lot of women wanted to be her, and men wanted to be with her. When Angie started university, she was still in a relationship with her high school sweetheart, a man named Lance Johnson. Although the couple were not a great match, Angie was calm and gentle, and Lance was hot-headed and extremely aggressive. At the end of her first year at university, Lance pulled a knife out on her during an argument. This would be the final straw, and Angie finally ended their relationship. Life took a better turn during her second year of uni. She joined a sorority, made a good number of friends, and she moved into a condo just near the university, and she even got a new boyfriend named Ben McCall. Ben was a construction manager in Dallas. He supported her through her studies, and it seems that the two got along okay. But Ben also had a second job, fending off the competition for Angie. She was pestered everywhere she went. Her ex Lance would still stalk her and would sometimes turn up to her house drunk and aggressive from time to time. And there was another student at the university who was extremely fond of Angie. His name was Henry. Henry was known to be incredibly intense with her. He would slyly take photographs of Angie, get them produced, and then stick them up around his dorm room. He would also proposition her, inviting her to his dorm relentlessly despite countless rejections. He even wrote her poems and letters. Henry was a real problem. And then there was another man named Russell Buchanan. Russell appeared to be a little more chill, shy even. She met him whilst out drinking and partying in a club. He was a few years older and had already graduated. He wasn't one of the men pursuing her per se. He was more like a friend at first. And finally, there was one more. Whilst out dancing, Angela caught the attention of another man, the kind of man that you never want to notice you. A manipulative, violent predator. A psychopath who stayed in the shadows, keeping his identity hidden from her, until it was too late. On the 12th of October 1984, Angie and her 2 friends Anita and Russell decided to hit the town. Angie was dressed to the nines as usual. She wore a black silk jumpsuit with some black pumps. However, on this night, she wasn't planning on getting too drunk, so she drove the group to and from the night out. This was because the following day was a huge American college football game, the University of Texas versus Oklahoma. Angie wanted to watch the game, and she didn't want to be hungover for it. On this night out, she had invited her boyfriend, Ben, to join them, but he declined, as he had to do work early the next morning. And so, Angela drove Anita and Russell to a bar and then a nightclub, and at some point they went to the Rio Room, which was a nightclub too. Angie tried her best to persuade Ben to come out once more, but again he declined. Angie, Russell and Anita danced and sang and had a great time. But the night soon changed when the usual calm and chill Russell got a little carried away, and he tried to kiss Angela. Angie rejected his advancements, making the atmosphere incredibly awkward. This was the beginning of the end of that night, which marks the beginning of the end for Angie. The group decided to call it a night, and they left the Club Rio room just before 1 a.m. According to Russell and Anita, Angie didn't appear to be intoxicated and was fully capable of driving safely. Russell was dropped off first just after 1 a.m, and then Anita was dropped off at around 1:30 a.m. Angie was now alone in her car, and she wanted to go and see her boyfriend Ben. Just after 1:30 a.m, Angela knocked on Ben's door on her way home, waking him up. The couple spoke briefly, with Angie teasing Ben about having work early the next morning. Ben described this conversation at his house as light-hearted before Angela left to head home. It took Angie around 15 minutes to make her way home, and when she got home, she picked up her phone and made a call to her boyfriend Ben. According to Ben, she was acting strange. The first thing she said to him was, "Talk to me." Their conversation was disjointed, and she seemed to be nervous, panicky, and was rambling. During the phone call, Ben heard noises in the background and asked her twice about them. Angie eventually told him that she had let a man into her house to use the bathroom and her phone. Just moments later, Ben heard her say, "The bathroom is down the hall." Angie then made it clear that she regretted letting the man in. Angie then asked Ben if there was a payphone at a nearby convenience store, to which he replied, "I'm sure there is." She relayed this information to the man to try and persuade him to use the toilet and then leave, but Ben didn't hear a response. Angie then told Ben that she would call him back and hung up the phone. But Angie never called back. When she didn't call back, Ben became concerned and tried calling her several times with no answer. That night, there was a mysterious man lurking in the darkness, and he saw an opportunity. The man in her apartment was not Henry, Lance, Russell, or Ben. This was a man who had been stalking her in secret. This mysterious man was Donald Andrew Bless Jr. Andrew Bless Jr. was a 36-year-old man from Jefferson County who lived in Texas. He was known to the authorities as a serial sexual offender and a kidnapper who committed a number of aggravated assaults of the extremely heinous kind on several women in January of 1977. He was given a 25-year sentence on the 14th of March 1978, but by just 1984 he had been released on parole. Having barely served a third of his sentence, he was clearly not deterred from seeking his next victim, and he preyed upon Angie. When she arrived home that night, she barely had a minute before Donald knocked on her door. When Angie answered the door, he requested to use the toilet and her phone, claiming that his car had broken down. This was, of course, a lie. When Donald had finished in the bathroom, he entered Angie's space. As he made his way past the kitchen, he grabbed a kitchen knife with a 5.5-inch blade. He walked into the room and asked her who she was talking to. This was when Angie put the phone down to Ben. Without hesitation, he unleashed a brutal, unspeakable attack on her. He picked her up and swung her around with so much force that her shoes came off. Donald then carried her to the bedroom. Brandishing a knife, he slammed her onto the bed and demanded that she take off her clothing. And with the knife directed towards her, he forced himself upon Angie. This is believed to have lasted for over 5 minutes. As this was going on, Ben was becoming increasingly worried, and so he got into his car and drove to Angie's home, making repeated calls on the way there with his new mobile phone, one of the first of its kind. But still, her boyfriend Ben got no response. When Ben arrived, he saw Angie's car parked outside, so he knew that she couldn't have gone far. He ran to her front door and knocked repeatedly, but no one answered. Ben tried to open the door, but all of the doors to the home were locked. Ben called Angie's phone again and could hear it ringing inside the kitchen, but there was no other sound. Donald stopped the attack when he heard Ben banging on Angie's door. This may have given Angie a glimmer of hope, but little did she know, this only made Donald even more desperate. He was determined to not get caught for this crime. He didn't want to spend another second in prison. And when an evil madman becomes desperate, he will do the unthinkable. With one hand covering Angie's mouth and the other holding the knife, he decided to end her life. Donald slammed the knife into Angie's chest, directly into her heart. He then stabbed her 18 times. The stab wounds were so viciously concentrated that it caused her chest cavity to close in, leaving a gaping hole in the center of her ribcage. The hole in her chest was large enough for someone as twisted as Donald to reach in and pull it out. He then placed it on her chest. Some of the stab wounds were done with so much vigor that they went through the heart and penetrated her spine. Meanwhile, Ben was still knocking on the door, but then he remembered Angie mentioning something about the convenience store nearby, so he thought that she had maybe taken this man there. Ben drove to the store, but he couldn't see her anywhere. Back at Angie's home, Donald had figured that Ben had now gone, so he rushed to the bathroom and frantically washed the blood from his hands before slipping out through the side entrance of the condo. Ben returned to Angie's home at 2:17 a.m. Donald was long gone. Ben made a call to the police to report the unusual situation. He waited at the front of the building for the first responders to arrive, and what they would soon find would leave the investigators horrified. Officers responded to Ben's call and arrived at Angie's condo complex at 2:40 a.m. Ben told them about the situation, the night out, and the strange phone call. The police were able to get a key to open her door. Officers proceeded to the bedrooms, where he discovered Angie's body. Angie was naked, covered in blood, and was lying face up with her eyes open. The officers continued their search of the house to ensure the attacker wasn't still present. They found a smudge of blood on the light switch, blood on the shower curtain, and traces of blood in the bathroom, indicating that someone had cleaned themselves up after the crime. Officers radioed in for an ambulance to come and collect the body. They then exited the condo and spoke with Ben. They told him the horrifying news that his girlfriend was dead. Instinctively, Ben tried to run into the home, but the officers stopped him. Both officers noted that Ben seemed to be extremely quiet, but remained cooperative. They became somewhat suspicious of him, but they would later learn that he was just suffering from extreme shock. Investigators then examined the scene. When they inspected inside, they noticed the following. There were no signs of forced entry, and a knife was missing from the kitchen. Fingerprint analysis showed all of the fingerprints belonged to Angie, except for one unidentified palm print on the toilet lid, and blood was found all over the kitchen and bathroom, hinting that the killer cleaned himself up. The doctor who undertook the autopsy revealed 18 stab wounds to Angie's chest, penetrating her left lung and her heart. DNA evidence was also found inside her, hinting that she was SA'd shortly before or after her death. All signs pointed to a murder of passion, suggesting the killer likely knew Angie. With this in mind, they quickly arrested Ben and interrogated him as if he was the murderer. They thought that his story of a strange man entering her home during a phone call seemed too convenient. Ben continued to insist that he was innocent, remaining calm despite the relentless pressure of the interrogation. The police then began speaking to several of Angela's female friends. During this, several names came up. Her ex-boyfriend, Lance Johnson, who had once held a knife on her. And then Henry, the man who was absolutely obsessed with her. And then there was Russell Buchanan, the friend who was with her the night she was murdered. The police then found that he only lived 5 minutes away from Angela, and that only 5 days after her murder, he left to go to a wedding in Houston. The detectives thought that this was suspicious. These 3 men were questioned by the police, and of course, all of them denied the allegations. They gave DNA and fingerprints over to the police to clear their names and to prove their innocence. Unfortunately, the method of using DNA evidence in those days was rudimental and nowhere near as accurate as it is today. Through these tests, they were able to prove that Ben, Henry, and Lance were clear. They had no part in the murder. However, due to the infancy of the technology, They were not able to rule out Russell Buchanan as a suspect, and so he became their prime suspect. Detectives turned their attention to Russell. They went to his home and searched his property. Russell fully cooperated with the police. He allowed them to search his apartment without any hesitation whatsoever, but inside they found an unsettling collection of knives. With this, the police pulled their guns on him and brought him back to the station for even more questioning. They were certain that he was the killer, and they intended to break him. But they couldn't find anything concrete linking him to the crime, and he was free to go. Investigators followed Russell everywhere he went, harassing him at every turn. They demanded he come to the station repeatedly, subjecting him to hours of grueling interrogations, each more intense than the last. Russell answered every question they had and passed a polygraph test, but in their eyes, he was already guilty. They even got one of Angela's friends to wear a wire and speak to him during a meal, desperate to find contradictions in his recollection of events, but the police couldn't find anything. They were after the wrong man, and this allowed Donald, the real killer, to strike again. And over time, the case of Angela went cold. Despite getting away with murder, Donald struck again and again. He essayed multiple women across the state before finally getting arrested for attacking a woman on the 14th of June 1985. He was arrested, and due to breaching the terms of parole by reoffending in the same manner, he was sentenced to life in prison. Donald was placed in the Allen B. Polunsky Prison in West Livingston, Texas, known for housing its dangerous criminals. However, evading the murder of Angie meant evading the death penalty, and for 20 long years he thought that he had gotten away with the crime. That was until 2004, until Sheila Wysocki. Sheila Wysocki was friends with Angela before she died. The two were extremely close, and she missed her dearly. But in 2004, Sheila claimed that she saw Angie in a vision. This vision shook her to the core. She saw Angie dead and saw parts of the crime scene, and this spiritual premonition fueled her to find out what happened to her best friend. Over the next 2 years, she made 785 phone calls to the Dallas Police Department, pleading with them to reopen the case. But her cries for justice were ignored. But her frustration turned into determination, and Sheila took matters into her own hands. She turned a room in her house into something she called the War Room. This was a command center dedicated to solving Angie's murder. She pored over evidence, piecing together the puzzle. This became her life's mission. She wanted to solve the case so desperately, and in time she shifted careers entirely and became a private investigator. After several years, her relentless calls to the police eventually wore them down. In 2006, Detective Linda Crum was assigned to the cold case of Angela Samota. As Linda sorted through the case, she found a treasure trove of DNA evidence for Angela, and frustratingly, this had never been tested. 2 years later, she submitted these samples for modern-day testing. In 2009, the results came back, changing the face of this investigation forever. The DNA was a direct match to Donald Bless Jr., who of course was already on the police database. Suffice to say, he was quickly charged with the murder of Angie. The trial would begin in 2010. Multiple women came forward, including his ex-wife. They testified as to the kind of man Donald was. They testified that he was an abuser and a sadistic man. Donald gave away nothing, showing no remorse throughout the entire trial. A truly despicable and evil human. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he was quickly found guilty of the murder. He was sentenced to death. Finally, because of the stubbornness of a loving friend, justice was finally served. However, Donald died in prison of a heart attack in October of 2022. He died whilst waiting on death row, and he never faced his final punishment. And after decades of suspicion, Russell's name was truly cleared, as many people maintained their suspicion throughout the decades. To this day, he speaks openly about the case. He speaks more freely now that the shadow of suspicion no longer follows him. In the wake of this case, the Dallas Police Department re-established its cold case unit, and fortunately, Angie's mother Betty lived to the age of 95, long enough to see justice for her beloved daughter. Perhaps now the Dallas Police Department will bring the same closure to other families still haunted by cold cases. Angie is buried alongside her mother, who died in 2021, under a headstone which is marked with one of Angela's own poems. The poem is on screen now for those who wish to read it.